Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast. In this series of episodes, we will be talking to historians, game creators, heritage professionals, and others about history, games, and the places where they meet. Once again, before we properly start, I'm in the middle of swapping things around here tech-wise, and so on the production level, you might notice some hiccups here and there. You might notice that sometimes some things might look differently from one week to the other, but rest assured, we are working on actively improving the quality of the podcast and upgrading our current equipment, and so you should see marked improvement in the production as we go on. This being said, in this episode, I, Eduard Gafton, your host for the podcast, I'm pleased to be joined by Cole Wehrle from Wehrlegig Games. Cole is a game designer with a strong academic background, having earned an undergraduate degree in journalism and English from Indiana University, and then an MA in 2012 and a PhD in the literature of British colonialism in 2017 from the University of Texas in Austin. His doctoral dissertation concerns how the experience of empire altered the way British writers imagined distances of time and space during the early and mid-19th century. In 2018, he started Wehrlegig Games with his brother, Drew, which handles the publication of historical games such as the award-winning Root, and the two games on focus in today's podcast, Pax Pamir and John Company. Cole, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. So for listeners unfamiliar with the two games featured today, Pax Pamir is a tableau builder game in which players take the role of 19th century Afghan leaders and small political factions attempting to piece together a stable state while being buffeted by a global rivalry between the British and Russian empires. A feature of Pax Pamir, which we will discuss, is that these two Western empires, the British and the Russian, are viewed strictly from the perspective of the Afghans who sought to manipulate the interloping Ferengi, or foreigners, for their own purposes. On the flip side, John Company, the second game after Pax Pamir and a series of games about empire by Wehrlegig, is a negotiation game in which players chart the rise and fall of the East India Company and take the roles of ambitious families out to make a name for themselves at the dawn of the British Empire. So very heavily historical games here today, everyone, very historically focused. So Cole, I want to start this discussion of the two games with Pax Pamir, and I want to ask you, how did the idea for the game Pax Pamir start? What was your eureka moment of like, this is it, this is kind of like the idea, this is the core concept I have for the game?
Well, I had been thinking about games for a while, not necessarily from the design perspective, but when I was in graduate school, I encountered the work of a designer named Phil Eklund, who was the first game designer I had seen. This is around 2010, 2011, who was trying to use games to make arguments that were more serious and more academically rigorous than a lot of other games, even in the historical game space. In particular, he was applying some of the methodologies that we associate with war games to other subjects and that level of rigor. And so I had play tested some games with him, specifically a game called Greenland, about the Little Ice Age and the conflict between Norse peoples and Inuit and Tuliat people in Greenland. And the whole thing I just found immensely engrossing. And while I was working on that, I was helping him playtest, and he asked me if I'd be interested in doing a game that connected with my doctoral research. And I had been doing a little bit of work on travel writing in Central Asia, and Phil had asked me if I'd be interested in doing a game about a period that is sometimes called the Great Game. Now, the Great Game is sort of like a proto-Cold War. That's one way of understanding it. And it was this big international rivalry between Britain and Russia over the course of the long 19th century. And this was an area that I had done a lot of research to. I had done a lot of research in this area, but it had always been adjacent to the political conflict. And I found that this seemed like a compelling subject for a game, but I was a little concerned about it because something that happens in some of the literature produced around this period is a lot of the tropes of the Cold War, the contemporary, or not contemporary, but the 20th century Cold War get kind of like backwards ported. And so you end up with a lot of like strange quasi James Bond style figures and a lot of casual racism and really complete misunderstandings of the nature of the conflict. So I just sort of sat on this for a long time and didn't know exactly the right way to approach it. And around that time, I was introduced to a book by Christine Noel about the formation of the modern Afghan state. And it was such a fascinating book because it re-centered the narrative of the Great Game and said, if you want to understand the early moves of the Great Game, you should really understand them from the context of the political players in Afghanistan. And so I got it in my head that perhaps it would be possible with a lot of research to do something like a post-colonial game about empire by recentering things on those who were outside of the global rivalry and who are experiencing it just from a different vantage point. So that investigation led to about 12 months of hard research and then another 8 or 9 months of design work that eventually became Pax Pamir, which was published first by Sierra Madre Games. And then the way the publication of that game was handled is I retained all the rights to the game. I just licensed it to that publisher. And then later on, after I had a lot more experience with game production, I formed a small outfit with my brother, and we did a pretty dramatic reimagining of the game, which became the second edition of Pax Pamir, which is the one that's popularly available.
I see. Yeah, I have questions about your own publishing house and your publishing studio later. I first want to ask you, so I'm personally not very familiar with PAX games. I as far as I understand it, this is kind of like a genre as in the same vein like wargaming is a genre. What are PAX games and how does Pax Pamir fit into this like subgenre of board games?
Well, the PAX games were initially designed by 3 people, Phil Eklund, Jim Gutt, and his son, Matthew Eklund. And the first game that was designed is a game called Pax Porfiriana, which is about the Mexican Revolution. Although it's about the longer Mexican Revolution. It kind of starts in 1890 or thereabouts and goes into the 1920s. And a PAX game is a design that attempts to capture a big historical event by principally using cards. And there are just a couple of shared mechanisms that you see in all these games. So a very common mechanism in the PAX game is what's called a card market. So instead of drawing cards from a deck, players are confronted with a 2-dimensional array. Usually it's about 12 cards in 2 rows of 6. And you purchase cards from that market, and the newer cards are more expensive, and the longer cards sit in that market, the cheaper they become. So that's one element that you see in a lot of these games. Another element is the tableau, which just refers to a row of cards that players control. So usually when you're buying those cards, you're playing that, you're adding them to your hand, and then from your hand, they're going in a little area in front of you that represents your assets. So an example of a tableau builder that isn't a PAX game would be something like Race for the Galaxy, or even a game like Seven Wonders could be called a tableau builder in a certain way, right? So why spend this time trying to define things that seem kind of general and used in lots of other games? Well, a lot of historical games that are a little more serious about their subjects don't use cards, and they certainly don't use cards in this way. And so the PAX genre was the first time in my mind that I had seen a historical game try to use some of the design techniques, mostly associated with games of the European school, or Euro games they sometimes get called, and then apply some of those techniques to the historical space. Now, there are some other distinguishing characteristics as well, and one of the biggest ones is the victory condition. So in many Euro games, you're accruing victory points, and the player who has the most victory points is going to win the game. In PAX games, victory is often about not having a certain threshold of points, but having more points of the right kind. So in Pax Porfiriana, you're kind of collecting 4 different types of victory points, which might mean different things depending on the context of the game. So if Mexico is kind of thrown into a Marxist revolution, the player who has the most power among the Marxists is going to become the victor. But if Mexico is sort of ruled by the military, it's going to be the player with the most victory points associated with the military. So you're kind of managing these complex victory portfolios. And what it does is it gets players thinking very directly about what victory looks like and what it might represent in different contexts. The first of these games was called Pax Pamir, covered the Mexican Revolution. Pamir followed and adapted some of those systems, and the series has since grown to include subjects such as the Renaissance, or even the most recent title. The most recent title is about the Vikings, which is designed by Jan Menker, who's I think based in Sweden. But the title before that, Transhumanity, actually covers the near future and concerns itself with essentially subjects as potboilery as the singularity and as germane as climate change. But it really tries to apply some of those systems to the world that we all live in today. So this is a very capacious system. It can handle a lot of different types of games, but the main thing that distinguishes itself is a real sensitivity to subject matter, and you see that both in the design of the cards and also the design of the victory conditions.
Very interesting. Yeah, it seems then that PAX Games would be absolutely the place to go for historical games. How does Pamir shake up the subgenre of PAX Games? What does it do that's unique to Pamir itself?
So a lot of tableau builders, and actually a lot of tableau builders have this characteristic that the more you play them, the further you get into a game, the more independent you become of the other players. So the classic example, I always use Race for the Galaxy as an example of this, because at the start of the game, you have to be very sensitive to the choices the other players make. But part of what you're doing in Race for the Galaxy is building enough capacity so that you can respond to different strategies. So you start kind of building your own engine. Pamir never lets you stop paying attention to the other players. So in Pamir, the main thing that separates Pamir from other games of the PAX series, I think there are two things. So the first thing is the game's economy. So most PAX games have a generative economy. You make a certain income, you spend that income doing various things. And in Pamir, the economy represents a political economy, and it operates on a principle of zero-sum exchanges. So if you're rich, if you have a lot of political capital to your name, the other players are poor. And various decisions you make in the game will kind of shift the water table of political capital towards one player or towards another. Now, the other thing that Pamir does that's a little different from other PAX games is it's really about the management of different kinds of diplomatic inertia. So there are 3 coalitions in the game. 2 of them are aligned with European powers. There's the British coalition and the Russian coalition, which are sponsored by those European powers. And then there's another coalition, which is the Afghan coalition, which is some kind of nativist force. Now, you are interested in having your coalition win. Of course, you want your coalition to establish a successful state in Afghanistan in the 1820s and 30s, but you also need to make sure that if there are coalition partners, if there are other players who are joining this coalition with you, that you have more influence in the coalition than they do. So the players are always trying to juggle their allegiance. And I might think, okay, well, I see that the British-backed coalition is in the dominant position, and I need to make the calculation of, can I defeat this coalition by working from the outside, or do I need to switch my loyalties to the British affiliated coalition and work from the inside to establish my own hegemony? And these are very real questions of politics that would be familiar to many readers of certainly of the period of empire, but also struggles in but also struggles in the 20th century and in the struggle of decolonization and thinking about how regimes change and move and, as they negotiate the post-colonial space.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting to me that it is still a game that teaches you about today. Like that was to me remarkable about doing my research on both of these games, that both of them teach you about today. And I want to ask you, because in an essay on your website, you say that with Pax Pamir, you wanted to first defamiliarize players and purposely put them in a setting that they knew very little about or of. And that this is related to the idea that the game is designed from the perspective of the Afghan leaders and political factions. What have been some of your players' reactions to this process, to playing the game, of feeling like you're not very familiar, you're in perhaps an unknown region, dealing with unknown forces? How do people usually react to being placed in this dynamic?
Well, I'm happy to report that the most common reaction I have is that people ask me for book recommendations,
Hmm.
which there is, as a former teacher, there is no better message I can receive than somebody who asks to learn more about a particular subject. But it really is all over the place. It's very interesting. I mean, what I find in observing players is that oftentimes for their first game, they really won't understand what the proper context is of the game. And so what happens is they come to the game with certain assumptions
Hmm.
about how this era works. And those assumptions are often based in their own knowledge of the recent past. I mean, I came of age basically as there was a war in Afghanistan. And that's true for many of the players of this game. And they often use, uh, the last 20 years of conflict as a lens to read the past. However, they will also find, I think, as they're playing the game, that their lens starts to develop and to shift and to expand, which is the desired impact. I wanted to be careful about picking the theme for the game because it was important that a lot of like students, a lot of players, they don't come to a subject without any knowledge. People
Hmm.
almost never approach something they don't understand from a position of complete ignorance. Instead, and this is true of students too, most people come to a subject at a position of negative knowledge. They actually do know things, but they're often wrong. And
Hmm.
so the first step as you're getting ready to teach a new subject, especially a difficult one, is to make sure that students unlearn certain parts, all of their mistaken conceptions, right? So with Pamir, I've seen that kind of unlearning happen many times. And as they develop a deeper understanding of the period, they start to find that the places in the design where a very different kind of story is being suggested than the one that they might have experience with. And so this is what, when I first started doing Pamir, I had this big idea in my mind that I really wanted to use the game form to help players and people generally understand the British Empire, at least how
Hmm.
contemporary scholarship understands the British Empire. But this was never a project that you could limit to just one game. And so it seemed like this was going to be a big multi-game series that was going to be approaching this giant subject from many different vantage points. But I wanted to start with a vantage point that was on the outside of this process, and Pamir kind of works to that end.
So if Pamir is about unlearning and then like demolishing some sort of like knowledge that we've all accrued, what do you think players learn from it? And obviously subsequent playthroughs, what is there to learn from Pax Pamir?
I think players will get a sense. I mean, I think games like novels. There's this old idea from Bakhtin called
Hmm.
heteroglossia, which I find so useful. Which is just this notion that a text can speak in many voices, and I don't even have control over all the voices that it can speak in. So there are always many lessons that we're pulling from a game. I think that Pamir helps players realize the different centers of agency in a conflict on the edge. Who are the different actors and what are their different intentions, and how do those intentions produce something that could be a quagmire or something like a decisive victory or a defeat? And so it really tries to center, like, where are the actors here? And when a hapless British agent spills into the market, that agent is arriving at a political situation that already has its own inertia. And that inertia is really important. So I really want players to understand that one of the things that makes conflict, especially a generational conflict like the one that occurred at that time, that makes them so complicated is that when it's not simply a matter of different players with different motives. It's the fact that those motives have inertia and they have movement, and certain trends might be unwinding that were generations in the making, and you can't simply reset. There is no such thing as a
Hmm.
reset when it comes to something like foreign policy. And so I want players to understand that. I also want players to understand the degree to which the people of Afghanistan lived in a fully realized society. This wasn't a blank spot in the map. They have a deep history in many respects, belonging to nations and identities much longer than those of the Europeans who are moving in. And so that's one of the reasons why when I introduce the subject, I always start by telling people that Pax Pamir is really about the collapse of this Durrani Empire, this empire, which, you know, was itself not terribly old, but was part of a very long imperial lineage. I mean, you can kind of connect it to the history of Persia. And it's in this moment of collapse that the players have to reckon with how you pick up the pieces. And so I like doing that, because it's not as if, oh, the British Empire got hungry and the Russian Empire got hungry and they went to look for things to scrap over. That's not the right way to frame it. The better way to frame it is to say, you know, there was this long period of relative stability in Afghanistan that has recently crumbled. And the various political factions in the region are attempting to reconstruct something like a stable state. Only now there are these interlopers. There are these global forces that are also shaping the thing that is getting constructed.
Interesting. I'm thinking even about the context of like how you told about Pax Pamir, about being the first game in the series about British colonialism in particular, and to make the segue into John Company. This is the second game. So if Pax Pamir is about unlearning, it's about defamiliarizing players, destabilizing the context in which they grew up in, or like with which they are familiar with. John Company is a game concerned with the formation of what you call in an essay called going into the empire, into empire. You call the imperial imaginary, which you describe as the process through which a people, an institution, or an empire think of themselves and the world in which they exist. So then, if Pax Pamir is about a new context, an unfamiliar context, and if John Company is about like the familiar context, have you like deliberately planned this, like, oh, firstly we're going to introduce a game in which you might be unfamiliar, and then something that like you are very familiar with? I think the East India Company, which is what John Company is about, is perhaps at least familiar to most of our listeners and viewers. So was this a deliberate kind of like output strategy?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you know, when I'm planning a big series of games, I think, you know, you're working from an outline, so you don't know precisely the shape it's going to take, but you want to have a strategy, and you want to kind of know what the payoff is and where you want to put your attention and your labor. So I think John Company has a few things it's trying to do, and they sometimes are working even at cross purposes. It's you know, I think it starts to, when you start trying to understand something like the East India Company, it's easy to get tangled because it's so complicated. One of the things that John Company tries to do is familiarize the internal parts of empire, because there is something that happens, a kind of sloppy history that happens occasionally, even from critics of the British Empire, who will assume the British Empire is a lot more consistent over time than it is. And in fact, you know, the degree to which we can call something the British Empire in the mid 17th century looks very different from what it looks like in the mid 18th century, and certainly the mid 19th century, and certainly the early stages of the 20th century. You know, it's even funny to use the term British Empire, and to say, you know, are we going to start the British Empire with the Acts of Union? Are we going to start the British Empire with the dissolution of the East India Company, et cetera? I mean, there are many different starting points that you can kind of, you know, match to these different things. And John Company is a little bit like an origin story. And because I think one of the things that I think is very interesting about the British Empire, and very useful when it comes to us thinking through our own actions and relationships to the states that we might inhabit or be citizens of, is how does an empire happen? You know, it isn't as if you have you know, I can't play the card of saying, well, you know, we have a dictator and Napoleon's going to go crown himself emperor, and then we'll call that this, you know, the Second French Empire. We don't quite have anything so easy when it comes to the case of the Brits. So John Company kind of attempts to track that long genealogy, and it does so by looking at the British East India Company, which critically is managed collectively. So all players who play a game of John Company kind of have some affiliation with the British East India Company, and they might direct this small division of the company or that small division, and they might have their own interests and aims. And in fact, the context in which the East India Company emerges has very little to do with India and a lot to do with the interests of these upstart families. And so the second thing that John Company does is it attempts to contextualize the origin story. And the frame it uses for contextualization owes a lot to writers like Edward Said, who understood the expansion of empire, understands the development of what we think of as like Victorian or British culture more generally as being related to this imperial experience. Excuse me. So, you know, why does someone, you know, why does Clive, to get specific, this is a history podcast after all, why does Clive behave so aggressively in India? Why does he take all of these risks? Well, you could talk about it for the money, but you can also talk about it for the status. I mean, when you read the letters between Clive and his father, there is an obsession with status, with the way that they were going to cash out of this, you know, this adventure they were all going on, right? It's no surprise that the first thing he does when he comes back is get a seat in Parliament, is buy a seat in Parliament in Powys Castle, right? You know, he's trying to find ways to use his experiences in India to catapult him to the top of high society. So if you want to understand how the East India Company grew to be what it is, you kind of have to look at how British culture worked, especially, you know, high society, if we can think about that as a term, how, like, what are the pressures it put on its actors? And so John Company attempts to do that work. I mean, really the game at its core is about context and culpability and how these things kind of relate over the course of the kind of long 18th century.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm thinking a similar question to Pax Pamir, and I think this might be even more contentious. How do players react? Because you call John Company a completely like uncompromising, like historically accurate, like depiction of the East Indian Company. How do players usually react? This is a context with which they might be very familiar, and you know, you might have encountered academics that have played John Company and have had strong reactions to it. What's kind of the reaction as a whole from what you've gathered?
Oh, the reaction ranges is an absolutely wide range of reactions. I've had players tell me that, you know, they find, usually players I think find the game transporting because it's a negotiation game. And one thing about negotiation games is they really stick you in a subject position, and you're going to find yourself like haggling and really, you know, in a way that compared to some other game forms where you have a kind of step of remove, in a negotiation game, you're going to find yourself, you know, embodying your role. And then afterwards, they might feel sick to their stomach, frankly. And there's a huge range. And the actual design of the game, so the game's narrative strategy actually draws a lot on the conventions of 19th century novels, especially those novels that were kind of quasi-historical. I'm thinking particularly of the work of someone like William Makepeace Thackeray, and there are others too. And there is a kind of dark comedy to those novels, which is the frame in which the game works. Like quite unfair things will happen to the players, and there are lots of like turns of fate and kind of surprising moments. And I'm trying to capture a kind of narrative spirit that will put them in the mindset of the people who are actually participating in what was going on. And so I don't want the game to shy away from that. My biggest goal when working on a title like this is I want the game to stick in the players' heads. I want to make a real impression, because what will happen is that impression will lead them to other paths of understanding the subject, right? So that they have the game, which will hopefully be a compelling object that they will continue to revisit, because it does have a lot. There's a lot to explore there, but that's just one avenue when it comes to understanding the subject. Maybe they're going to go read a book or watch a documentary or try to convince one of their friends to play the game, and they'll have discussions about the game. So, you know, I think it's a little bit like working on a play, right? I oftentimes think that, you know, in the space of video games, oftentimes our touchstones are primarily cinematic.
Yeah.
Yep. When we talk about video game, and I think you can especially see this in what are sometimes called AAA video games, right? Those high budget video games, they draw a lot on the language of cinema. And I think board games can gain a lot from drawing on the language of theater. And to the degree to which we can understand John Company through theater, I think it's best understood as a tragicomedy, right? Like this is absolutely a game that deals with some very upsetting topics. And this is why, I'll have sometimes players will approach me and say, I just don't know if I want to go to this show to enact this history. And to me, that is a very reasonable, I think that's a completely reasonable reaction to a game like John Company, which is why I'm always very careful when I talk to players about it, because I want to make sure that, in the same way that I don't know if I want to go see Macbeth if I'm feeling a little cloudy myself, right? And I don't want to necessarily elevate the game form that high, but so I'll be modest here, but at the same time, there are big payoffs too, right? When players, like, they're going to gain a very intimate understanding of how something like the East India Company could happen. And that insight, it can be very, very useful, especially when you start to think about your relationship with the contemporary transnational corporation like Amazon. And that can be a pretty uncomfortable realization to have. It's not free. And so I think I always want players to kind of understand what the exchange is and what the whole, point is. And this is why, as a policy, I don't really engage in questions of fun. Like it's not, it's one of those subjects that, like, I hardly know what that word means. And I think players just get different types of joy from different things. And, spending a day in the library, deepening my understanding of something, like, that sounds like a great time. And I think I kind of put John Company on the same order. And, at the same time, I think it's important to say that, like, the game is sometimes very funny and sometimes very, silly, and it has a kind of satirical edge to it. But that satire is always punching up. Never. And I think that it's very important that, it never punches down. It tries to treat its subject with great sensitivity.
I'm thinking now of the core audience for board games who sit down to play a board game and think, oh, I'm going to have such a great time. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun with my friends, with my family, whomever. How do you market a game like John Company or like Pax Pamir, the kind of game which is like, heavily historical, and games like John Company, which, like, have a lesson behind it, right? Because you want people to think about it and, like, start a conversation about, like, British colonialism. How do you market these two games, especially when you have most popular board games, like even like Settlers of Catan or even Seven Wonders, which at the core of the game is that it is fun. How do you go against perhaps like the bigger boys in the industry?
Well, you market them carefully. That's the key thing. One of the things, so this actually gets into why I'm doing it through Wehrlegig and not Leader. Historical games that cover sensitive subjects have to communicate themselves very clearly and carefully to their audience. I don't want anybody to buy this game without knowing what it is. And that means you have to wear your heart on your sleeve a little bit. It also means that you need to accept that you're not competing with Catan. And so my brother and I's whole business model is built entirely around direct sales. We don't want our games in general distribution. Now, sometimes there are shops that will buy games. We have no objection to a shop purchasing some of our games, but they had to find us, which means they know what we're about and what we're doing in the general project. And it's the kind of reason why I'm happy to go on a podcast like this, where the audience is going to be a little more historically literate and a little more interested in the subject. I'm not really I'm not really interested in being on the Today Show or something. I would rather actually not have a general audience working through these games, because it's not an appropriate subject matter for the widest possible audience. Now that means that These titles will never sell as much as the work that I do
Mm-hmm.
through leader games like Root. Just they won't, and that is completely fine. And so, you know, it's funny whenever when Drew and I were working on the Kickstarter page for John Company, we actually built it with an ethos that said, you know what, this Kickstarter page has a lot of words on it, many
Mm-hmm.
more words than most Kickstarter pages. And it starts with an essay. It doesn't start with like, oh, here's all the fun you're going to have. It's like, no, actually, we're starting this Kickstarter page with an essay set that says the argument, where we ask people to really grasp what they're getting ready to get involved with.
And there's a disclaimer as well. Yeah, I remember
Yep.
that was the first thing that struck me as well coming into this, like reading about it, like, oh no, this is an argument.
So we do a lot of very careful audience cultivation. And we try not to exclude anyone. Anybody who's interested in this subject is more than welcome to purchase our games. But in the way that we market them and talk about them, it's really important that players understand what we're all about.
Mm-hmm.
And we just have to be very careful about growth or anything like that, because we really do, you know, I think there is such virtue to staying small. And I think one of the interesting things about the board game space is it is possible to make a living by just producing to a small audience and
Mm-hmm.
doing these kind of like deep bore investigations, right? And so I'm very thankful that I get to do kind of a little bit of everything. But when it comes to the history games, I sort of don't mind them being a little obscure
Mm-hmm.
and being a little detailed, because that, you know, that's the sort of work that I want to be doing right now. And it's quite a freeing thing to not attempt to win a spiel with every title,
Mm-hmm.
because it allows the games to get like a little weirder and stranger. And this is true even in the games that I've worked on that aren't historical. I think, you know, I come into every game project with a real specific hope for what I want the game to be. And I try not to worry too much about selling tons of copies, and instead just try to make sure that the game is the best realization of what that project could possibly be.
And I think Kickstarter is absolutely the right platform for like having this sort of audience that like will go through paragraphs, will go through your arguments, would read through this rather than like someone who just like goes to a store and picks it up and then looks at it. I think definitely Kickstarter has kind of cultivated this sort of audience. We mentioned fun, and this is interesting because we ask everyone who comes to the podcast about the balance between historical accuracy and fun. We are a history and games lab. This is the history and games lab podcast. There seems to be always a conflict between like, if it is always uncompromising in terms of like historical accuracy, there is something gameplay wise that's left of the table. What do you think is the ratio with Pax Pamir and John Company? Are there like gameplay features that you've just had to cut, or like that like you've changed?
So I mentioned earlier that I try not to think about fun too much, which is absolutely true. I mean, I am interested in making a design that is interesting and compelling. And some players may find it fun, and other players may feel like, I don't know, they had to attend a too boring, you know, a lecture that was a little boring. I don't really mind. I mean, people have different, people get their enjoyment from different things. But one thing I think a lot about is where are the places. So, you know, all games, especially historical games, are built around certain models, which are in turn are built around certain theories, certain assumptions, certain arguments about how the past worked, right? And that's certainly true of war games. I mean, you have opinions about the effectiveness of armor in a battle in World War II, or the importance of supply on an operational scale. There is some argument that is underpinning the model that you're presenting. Now, many questions about accuracy have to do with framing and perspective, and the places where the model might elide certain realities, right? So if I want to make a game where I'm making an argument about the importance of water in some, you know, campaign in North Africa, maybe I can't spend a lot of time on different classes of machine gun, because I want, this game is about water, right? And so you're having to kind of mute different things. It's actually a lot like the process of adaptation. You know, when you're adapting something, you really have to think about, what does my current form demand of me? And is there a way I can lean into this form? And actually, I think, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I really admired the recent adaptation of Alcott's Little Women.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it's a brilliant adaptation, and it really jumbles the narrative. I mean, Little Women is kind of a very traditional melodrama. It has a very set structure. It's not too fancy, but Gerwig's adaptation is incredible, because it really aggressively reimagines it in a way that has such cinematic fluency. It's amazing. And so when I think about applying, history to a game, I think about that kind of adaptation. Like, what is the truest representation of this history? And that may mean that certain things get hidden. So I'll give you a classic example. So, I mentioned earlier that PAX games use a lot of cards, and that before PAX games, at least to my mind, you don't see a lot of history games really use cards. Now, that is kind of a banana statement, because obviously we have card-driven war games. We have games like Up Front. There are plenty of history games that use cards. But I think one reason why that there sometimes is a reticence to using cards as a central mechanism in a history game. I think you probably saw arguments about this back in, Mark Herman's We the People days, is if you have events, historical events, and so you have a card for, the Congress of Vienna, and a card for Austerlitz, and a card for the French Revolution. And when you shuffle them in a deck, you've totally screwed up causality, haven't you? And so, what does it mean that all of your cards have jumbled the timeline? It means that you messed up causality, which means that your historical model is probably bunk. And so this happens with Pamir. In Pamir, the earliest cards are kind of from like about 1804, 1805, and the latest cards in the Pamir deck might stretch into the 1850s. Now, that's a 50-year period, and when you shuffle the deck and deal out the initial market, you might have cards that are 2 generations apart, sitting next to each other in the market. So how possibly could this spy have encountered this warlord? This doesn't make any sense. Now, that's a little bit of a lie. That's a place where the accuracy of my model is totally broken down. But I'm getting something for that cost. So I'm paying accuracy, but what I'm getting is the sense of possibility, the sense that this person could have run into a person like this in a different time. And if I'm trying to capture the mind, the perspective, the effective position of the people living and breathing at that time, then that sense of uncertainty is really, really important. Now, on the other side, if I'm going for total accuracy in all things, history can sometimes become a little processional, right? We have to like play the hits, hit all the beats, right? And I usually say that I would love for a historical game to produce the historical outcome 15 or 20% of the time, because the fact that what happened is not necessarily the most likely thing that happened. And of course, I think counterfactuals are actually a really important part of the game form, and especially if you're trying to understand uncertainty, you need counterfactuals. And so I always, I'll usually say that, especially when working on something like John Company, which has lots of butterfly effects, I'll usually say it's okay for history to go off the rails. East India Company collapses in 1720. That's fine. East India Company never conquers any part of India, but instead continues to operate as just a commercial enterprise. That is also fine. That's something that could have happened. The main thing is that when you do, spin off onto one of those counterfactuals, that there is a causal chain that feels meaningful, and that's where the strength of the model is.
Interesting. It's very alternative history in that sense. It reminds me of something like The Man in the High Castle, of just what if this had happened, right?
Yeah.
So different
I
variants.
The key thing has to do with that causal chain, right? Because I don't want and this is where questions of scope and scale become really, really important, because I don't want my Romans to build rocket ships.
Yeah.
Right. So there's always limits to this. And so instead, I really try to spend a lot of time with primary documents and look at what people at the time thought might happen and were interested in, and then just kind of use the dreams, thoughts, aspirations of the people who the game is about to sort of set the parameters for the model.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm thinking about like Romans building rocket ships. That happens in Civilization, and
yes,
and a bunch of these like 7 wonder games which span great periods of time. I want to ask you now to move on to a different conversation a bit. Both John Company and Pax Pamir can be played on their own. You can be you can be just one player playing the game. What do you think is the value of solo play? Beyond obviously learning the game, beyond getting more familiar with them. What do you think is there for players to gain from playing your game solo? Because in most cases, I think board games are played in at least 2 people. So how do you play Pax Pamir or John Company alone, and what do you gain from that?
So I'll give you the cynical answer and the romantic answer. The cynical answer is that there are simply enough solo players that it's always worth doing. So I know that any title that I'm able to include a good solo mode for will just increase the marketability of that title. Now, I mentioned earlier that this would seem to be in contradiction to my notion that I don't want everybody to play the game.
Yeah.
But, I'm also interested in figuring out what the sustaining audience for a title is and making sure that I can get those games to the kind of people who would want to play them. And if that means investing a few months and maybe bringing in a designer that specializes in solo play to help, which is what we've done with both Pamir and John Company. And it's an obvious exchange to do, right? Now, the other answer is the games that I work on are quite confrontational. And that is just not suited to all players, and especially not players who would feel comfortable playing in a space that covers these topics. I mean, some players simply don't want to play against their friends, especially if the subject of the game is so sensitive. And solo games, and along those lines, provide a player with a way to interact with the title that is a little bit more kind of scholarly and quiet. And I think there's just a lot of value to that. There's a designer whose name I've completely forgotten, but who made a game called The Mission about early Christianity. And I think all of the games, or most of the games that he's done, have been solo games. And he's kind of a controversial designer. He has a lot of like weird takes. But the fact that his games are solo games makes them much more meditative, and it's a little bit closer to the experience of reading a book. And for some subjects, that might be the better way to approach the subject, especially for certain players. So the rise of solo games to me, even though I'm not I don't do much solo playing myself, I don't think of it cynically. Even though I think that there are material reasons why we will almost always pursue solo modes, I actually think that it's generally a good thing for the hobby because it does provide an alternate way for people to engage with the text.
Absolutely, because it is kind of like a new way to experience board games. Even in my personal experience, board games have always been about a group of players playing together. So I'm not as used to the act of playing a board game by myself as I would be with like obviously reading, right? And so this is, having solo play be a feature of both these games is a feature that's come with the 2nd edition. And as we mentioned before, this is the 2nd edition for both of these games. So I want to ask you, what's changed in between the years and editions? How do you view the games yourself now that you've had, a few years to remove yourself from them?
Well, I try with the 2nd editions to clarify my arguments because the audience has grown, especially after the success of some of the non-historical games I've done. I'm grateful to have a wider audience than I've ever had, and that audience demands more clarity in argumentation. And so I try to, with the 2nd editions, really clarify what the game is doing. The other thing is, the first editions of these games had a lot of production constraints. There was very few options when it came to, kind of more boring things like how many player aids to have, and more fun things like what's the nature of the playing piece, or of the board. And one of the things that the direct to customer model allows my brother and I to do is to figure out precisely how we want a game to look and to make sure players get that game. So we don't worry too much about budgets. We don't worry too much about, trying to make sure that the cost per retailer is going to be good enough that retailers are going to want to order X many copies a month. We don't really care about all that stuff. Instead, we think about what is the best way this game can possibly look? What is the proper price for that game? And then we bring it to market at that price. So, in a lot of other game design, you ask yourself questions like, okay, at the $60 game market, I'm competing with Wingspan or Root or whatever. At the $80 or $90, maybe I'm competing with Scythe. The $40, maybe I'm competing with Catan. And then you try to build your game so that it competes in one of those areas. We just don't care because we know that we have enough people who are willing to follow us and who trust us from Pamir that we can kind of set the price at whatever makes sense for the production and kind of work backwards.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I think this is also makes sense for you to start Wehrlegig Games and to have this ethos of like, we don't really care about like competing necessarily. We just want to have the best product that we can deliver.
Well, and the one thing I'll add to that is that Drew and I love this process because it allows us both to work on every part of the project. I do all the graphic design for the Wehrlegig Games, and I work on the icons, and sometimes we have some artists come and help. But we handle pretty much everything. Now this is great, but it also means that we don't grow, and the games take a really long time to make. John Company took about 2 years to make, and it's not done yet. So it has 2 or 3 more months to go before. Well, actually, that's not true. It has 2 months before it starts entering production. And after John Company's done, it will be, another 1 to 2 years before we bring the next project to a Kickstarter, because it just takes a really long time. Now at Leader, which is, where I am right now is my day job, we can work much faster because we have a lot of infrastructure.
Yeah, and interesting, and even in terms of like production, yeah. But and your workflow, how you've like divided in between these two companies. I want to ask you about like your own academic experience, research, and just overall interest. How has it helped you in designing both games? Usually we have people who say, "Hey, like I just love this historical period, so I'm just gonna design a game around it." I feel like you might have started from the other side of the coin of like, oh, I have an interest in history, therefore I'll design the game. How do you feel like your academic experience has like helped you design these games, and how has it informed the games that you've made?
Well, I took a class. One of my first classes in college was a class on Byzantine history, and I remember in the margins of my notebook scribbling little game ideas, and they weren't things I ever thought I would make. It was just I was just trying to understand like the theme system and how like Byzantine tax policy, how did that work? And I would just kind of like sketch these little models. So I was always thinking about games from the perspective of pedagogy, and usually they were just note-taking tools. And I've been playing games for a long time. I love games as a form, but I wasn't attempting to be a game designer. I wanted to be an academic. The university offered me so much. I'm always careful to warn people about graduate school because it's so difficult. But I found that I had access to a lot of resources. I had the time and space and mentorship opportunities to learn the Adobe suite, which is an important thing to learn if you're going to get into game design. And I did a lot. I picked up a lot of freelance graphic design work, and that was extremely helpful in getting me started in game design. It also taught you how to project manage, which is another important skill when it comes to designing games. So by the time I started doing a big project like Oath, which I knew early on in the development of Oath, this is a upcoming or currently releasing project from Leader Games. By the time that I started getting Oath underway, I had managed projects that had taken 2 or 3 years to execute. So I knew what it was going to take to get that project across the finish line. It also, I think my academic background really helped me become a much more systematic thinker. When I compare my notes from my undergraduate years to those from later, I got a lot more careful and a lot better at trying to like understand my own ignorance and then attempt to compensate for that ignorance by doing, the work of reading and the work of talking to people who know a lot more about these things than I do. So all that stuff is very kind of interconnected. And then what I found with the game industry was that many of the academic skills that I had picked up plugged directly into how the game industry works. And I think this is actually true of most project-based industries. And I think a lot of people who find that, it's a little hard to find, it's actually extremely hard to find a job in the academy right now. A lot of folks who picked up those skills should know that they have direct application to pretty much any field, and that they should feel empowered to go get the job of their dreams.
Yeah, perfect. That really sounds so good, especially even coming from me, who I'm just about to finish my MA and then graduate with transitive skills, and people saying, hey, like, these skills are transitive. It feels liberating to hear you say, hey, like, even as a game designer, most of the skills that you pick up in university will help you. So you said you play games in your spare time. What kind of games do you play? Which games would you recommend to our audience?
Well, I play all sorts of games. I love the game form, and I love the different types of things that games can do. And so, this last weekend I was in a cabin with some friends, and I played a lot of cockroach poker, crack-a-lackin' poker, which I love. A wonderful game. My brother and I play a lot of 18xx games and war games whenever we're together. We love economic and train games. I've been having a lot of a game called 1882 on my mind lately. And I also, I've been playing lots of Netrunner, especially the new Nissi project, which is a fan project that is kind of recuperated Netrunner. It's really interesting, and it's so affordable. It's like never been as good a time to play Netrunner as like right now. And for listeners of the podcast, some good history games, I've been really enjoying Pax Viking, which is the newest Pax game, which covers the Viking period, kind of the 9th and 10th centuries. It might be a little bit later than that. It might be like the 11th century, but it's fascinating. A lot of the literature and lore and media around Vikings really emphasizes the pillaging, and this is a very fulsome history of that kind of early Middle Age period, and it's really lovely. And then one of my favorite recent games is a game by GMT called Atlantic Chase, which is about the Kriegsmarine and naval warfare in the early stages of World War II. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's a beautiful design, very well executed by GMT Games.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I took note of all of the games. I'll put them in the description alongside most other links, to do with you and your projects. What comes next for you? You said you have a sci-fi project in the works, right? Like, can you tell us about where your head's at in terms of your near future?
Sure. So right now at Leader Games, we're finishing the Root Marauder expansion, which is the most ambitious project in the Root universe that we've done. There's just a lot of new content. We've been very busy working on it. I am in the early stages of working on a science fiction game, which is, in a weird way, a kind of follow-up to Oath. It does similar kind of work to Oath, but in a different way. It's been lovely to work on this game because it's one of the simplest games I've ever designed. And it's nice to work on a game that I could teach my mother to play. And in terms of historical games, I'm working on a project right now about municipal politics and the building of roads. And this gentrification, a lot of issues kind of around, the kinds of issues that are confronted by a city, trying to decide what to do and to execute those things. So I'm working on that game. There's a reasonable chance that it will become the next project that Wehrlegig does, perhaps along with a game called An Infamous Traffic, the second edition of that game, which is about the Opium War. So I might pair those projects together in some way.
Very interesting. Yeah, and I'll link to your Twitter, to the website for Wehrlegig for everyone to keep up to date with your games. My final question is, if you had one piece of advice for people wanting to get into game design, what would that be? The audience for this podcast is mostly students or people in academia. I assume, like you are, like you used to be. What kind of advice would you have for us, for anyone, wanting to transition from academia to game design, or do both at the same time?
Well, the The main piece of advice is to find ways to learn every part of the process. When you're designing a game, you have to produce iterations. And so those iterations mean that you need to have an idea, and you need to print something out, and then you need to play it, and then you need to react to that play, and you need to adjust your files and think about it, and you need to print it out, and then you need to play it again. And you have to do this thing called the iterative loop. And the tighter you can get that loop, the more you can understand the different steps of the process, the better you will do. The more likely your game is going to ever get finished. And to that end, I always encourage aspiring designers to pick up some experience with graphic design. You know, if you're a university student and you have access to the Adobe suite, learn Illustrator and InDesign. They're incredible. They're such useful programs. And even if you don't have access to those programs, there are a lot of free alternatives, like the Affinity projects. And Affinity isn't quite free, but it's close. I mean, it's just not that expensive compared to the Adobe products, but there are even completely free alternatives. Learn some graphic design and just get designing. The sooner you can get it onto the table, the sooner you're going to be doing the work of game design.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. And before we go, let me get our viewers and listeners up to date with what happened from the History and Games Lab in recent weeks and days. So on May 25th, 2 days ago, as of the recording of this podcast, we organized Gaming the Divine Comedy, a History, which is a talk by game designer Andrea Angelino. He looked at how Dante's Divine Comedy has been gamified, and the recording of this Zoom talk is available now on our YouTube channel, as well this podcast, of course. You may find a link in the description of this podcast, again, as with all of the other mentions that we've had so far. If you have any feedback or would like to get in touch for a potential podcast appearance, our DMs are open at Twitter, @HandGLab, or you can email us at @HandGLabpodcast@gmail.com. For more on the History and Games Lab, please access our link again in the description, where you will find all of our output plus our social media. Cole, thank you again so much for being here. Where could our listeners find more about you?
The best way to either get in contact with me or just follow my work is on Twitter. You can find me at Cole Wehrle. That's COLEWEHRLE. I'm also, I have my direct messages open. I'm happy to respond to people who have any questions.
Perfect. And I'll have a link to your Twitter as well in the description. Final word, Cole, what would you like to emphasize if you want our viewers and listeners to remember one single thing from this podcast? What would that thing be? What is your final word?
I want people to remember that games can be a very powerful discursive form, and that there's so much argument, so much that a game can reveal. And that when players sit down to play a historical game, they shouldn't be afraid to ask a lot of that historical game.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Once again, thank you so much to Cole for joining me. Join us in a few weeks' time for episode 8 of the podcast. For the next episode, we have something very exciting that I cannot reveal at the moment, but fans of distilled spirits might want to stay tuned. Thank you, Cole, for joining me. Until next time, thank you for listening, and we'll see you around. Bye.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye. The Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast is a production of the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab. For more on us and future podcasts, connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook by searching for Edinburgh University History and Games Lab, which should be the first result. Music for today's episode is Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod, used under filmmusic.io standard license. For more information on the link and the license, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.